These Small Hours with Russell Cordell Staker. Hello, my friends. This is Russell Cordell Staker, and you are listening to These Small Hours podcast. It is the evening of 18 December 2022 in Austin, Texas, and I welcome you here with me this evening at this time of Christmas. To be frankly honest, I'm not exactly sure how I'm going to weave myself through what it is that's in my mind and heart. I've been giving this a lot of thought over the last several days. Probably over the last month, I kind of had a sense about what I'm going to be doing tonight. And I'm going to cover some ground tonight that might be a little bit, I'm going to see how this goes. There's going to be a bit of a discovery for myself, a bit of a catharsis here. But I think the message tonight will be one that I hope will lend itself well to this time of giving and care and of memory, this time of Christmas. And regardless of the denomination that you find yourself in, I will speak directly about Christmas. This is a time that, regardless of what one's faith is, it's a time of giving and care. And I think that there is a lot to be stated about the idea of thinking of others at this time of year as opposed to the self. One of the things that has been in my mind that has resonated, or at least been deep in my thinking, has been this idea of being contented with the time, here and now, at Christmas. This time of Christmas is a bit of a contradiction. There's an injunction tied to it. Of course, there's all the things on the surface that we think about at this time of year. But to insist, as it were, that Christmas is just something in the present and something that we look forward to, and we as families gather and have these traditional things that we engage in that enliven the moment and create this energy and this euphoria and this joy. There is also a sense of the past that it comes out very clearly during this time of Christmas. The past is something that is so powerfully to be dwelled upon, in fact, that it lends itself to this idea of a heightened sense of the present. Not so much in the future, but the right now, obviously, and the memories that come that make the present more poignant. I started thinking about one of my favorite writers, and during this time of Christmas, a lot of people will think about Charles Dickens, the famous Christmas Carol, and other Christmas stories that he wrote and published in 1843, first serially, and then it came out more fully thereafter. But there have been a lot of iterations of A Christmas Carol, and for very many reasons, it's a timeless tale that continues to be not only edifying, but extremely important to the present. But it reminds us that what is in the past is also equally important. Dickens reminds us that we are all scattered from our families. Even the ones that we're with right now, there are memories of those that are not with us. And this is a direct tie or direct insight into the idea of death. That death is ever present during the time of Christmas. And as I've gotten older, it seems to be something that I think about a lot more of. And I don't mean this in a heavy, morbid sort of way, but it's a reminder of how fleeting and how short this moment, this life of ours really is. That as families gather, we are also hyper aware of the separation of those that cannot gather with us, that the separation by death from loved ones, and in general in much need of those that may be lacking in Christmas spirit, maybe because this isn't a time of joy. It could be a hard time, or it could be a moment that brings out a sense of loss or of memories that cannot be fulfilled because of those that can't be with us. That, in the words of Charles Dickens, that can win us back to the delusions of our childish days is one of the wants that brings out so clearly in the idea of Christmas. And so, to circle back, and this is where I'm heading tonight, and I hope you will take my hand, if you will, rise and walk with me, that what I want to bring out tonight in this time of Christmas is a message of contentment with the time as it is now, here and now at Christmas. To remember and to forgive, but also to be aware of the sense of this moment that is brief, that death is around the idea of life. It's not a negative thing, but it's a separation, and it's a wall that presents itself during this time of joy, and that the shadows that we inhabit in our memories are things that are important because they compel us to hopefully make the present moment more full and more true. I was thinking about the character Jacob Marley when he makes the visit to Ebenezer Scrooge, and Scrooge is curious as to why Jacob Marley would come to him. And Marley opens up. He says, "Why did I walk through crowds of fellow beings with my eyes turned down? Mankind should be our business, Ebenezer, but we seldom attend to it." I want to read something briefly in the text here. Hang on one second. I'm going to pull this up. Scrooge sees himself again as a younger man when he is with the first of the three ghosts. And in seeing himself once more as the young solitary boy in the schoolhouse that he was sometimes sent to and neglected, the memory, as he sees it, is still very fresh to him, although one gets the impression, and I did as I read this the first time, and in the many occasions that I've revisited it, and I've seen various versions of adaptations of this in film, that there is a sense that he had forgotten, and yet when he is presented with this image of himself as a young boy, he still knows every detail and its meaning of what that time was for him, and it comes back with such force, such ferocity, that he sobs when he sees himself as this little boy. And I want to read this little passage very early on in this particular moment, in which Dickens writes that Scrooge sat down upon a form and wept to see his poor forgotten self as he had used to be. Not a latent echo in the house, not a squeak and scuffle from the mice behind the paneling, not a drip from the half-thawed waterspout in the dull yard behind, not a sigh among the leafless boughs of one despondent poplar, not the idle swinging of an empty storehouse door, no, not a clicking in the fire, but fell upon the heart of Scrooge with softening influence and gave a freer passage to his tears. The word there used that maybe contradicts what I just said is softening influence, but in many ways that's actually a bit of a contradiction, which goes back to this injunction that I mentioned at the very beginning, is that Dickens writes it in this softer tone, and yet the power and the velocity, the force of that memory comes back very strongly to him. And it got me thinking about one of my other favorite writers, Virginia Woolf, in her novel Mrs. Dalloway, which I've mentioned a few times in a few other podcasts, but there is a line specifically in Mrs. Dalloway where Mrs. Dalloway describes London, life, London, this moment of June, the memory of the very minute, the very small, the intricate details of any particular moment, at any moment in our past, when we really are brought back to a great memory of a moment, whether it's one that is vitally important to our life or one that could have been just run of the mill, believe it or not, has such a strength of position in terms of what the memory can conjure up that it brings back an emotional range that I think sometimes can be quite surprising. And Scrooge falls into that. And that's, I think, one of the themes that I want to touch on tonight. And as I'd mentioned at the very beginning here, I'm not sure I'm going to be able to pull this through the way I would like to. And so tonight I'm going to let this go from the heart. This is entirely unscripted. I have a few things that I want to try to pull together, and I hope I succeed in this because I think there's something powerful to be said here. And I'm going to read the entire third stave of A Christmas Carol in just a moment to pull this into a very sharp focus with this idea, as I'm titling this podcast, Contented with the Time Here and Now at Christmas. Very briefly, before I get into that, I want to give a little bit of texture about Charles Dickens, who was a very prolific writer, and he was a popular writer in his time. Charles Dickens, when he wrote A Christmas Carol, it came out in 1843. This was a moment in his own writing life in which he wrote out of almost desperation. And I won't get into all of the history of this. That's not the point tonight. But this is a direct output, this remarkable story that has continued on now. We're almost 200 years downwind from when he initially published this, when it came out in 1843, and it not only continues to resound, but it's fully alive for generations of people all over the world that know this story. It is a direct output of the very wanderings that Charles Dickens was known to do, and a lot of writers, for that matter, present and past, have been known to be great city walkers. Charles Dickens was one of the great city walkers. He was known to walk the city streets of London miles at a time. In fact, I'd read somewhere that sometimes he'd go on 10, 20-mile walks, which is, that's a lot of walking. I mean, even when I go for a walk a mile or two, and you walk through and think through various thoughts, he would literally sometimes go on these walks and he would take in the entire sense and feeling of London, observing the sights and sounds and smells of the old city. The Victorian London, it was the largest, most spectacular city in the world. Maybe Paris would be commensurate in its own unique way, but London, Victorian London particularly, was a remarkably vast, dank, dark, beautiful, nuanced, complex city, and he would take all of it in. There were little tidbits as I started doing some just background reading as I was thinking about this before I put this podcast, the ideas to this together, is that, for instance, personal cleanliness, which, this is, in the early 19th century here, which, by the way, side note, when I think about one of my most influential writers that I've read for years and I adore, is William Shakespeare. That's a good, 200-300 years before even this particular time. So this observation of personal cleanliness would have been amplified even more. But one of the things about that time in Victorian England during Dickens' day was that cleanliness was not a big priority, nor was clean laundry. So in close, crowded rooms, the smell of unwashed bodies was stifling. One of the things that we read about, and that's just I'm just giving this to give some texture, just to think about the crush of humanity in closed spaces in a very complex, very heavily populated city. I think London at that time would have been about 2 million or so. I think by the time London was in the mid 1800s, and again, I'm just going off the top of my head, I've done some reading in the past, crested towards about 6 million souls. So this is a very big city. At the time that he wrote this in 1843, it was probably between 1 million and 3 million souls in London. He would walk through these streets, and in close proximity, just the observation I gave would have been very redolent. Victorian days, there were a lot of poor. We see that at any point in history, but in Victorian England, those that did not have money, the poor, the indigent, it was also a stifling problem. And the answer to dealing with the poor at that time was there was a law that came out. I think I'm going off some notes here. Based in 1834, there was a law that came out called the New Poor Law. And it required that all of the parishes in the surrounding area would band together and create regional workhouses where those that needed aid could apply for aid. And it was basically little more than a prison for the poor. Civil liberties were entirely denied in most cases. Families were separated. Human dignity was entirely bereft. It was destroyed. And the poor were often went to great and extraordinary lengths to avoid this very relief, which is just it's remarkable to think about, and it's a stifling sort of consideration. Going back to what I'm leading into with this idea of Christmas, so I started off with these wonderful, this sense of what Christmas is about. The setting for A Christmas Carol, one of the great themes is, of course, those that have and those that have not. And for Dickens, this was something that was very predominant in his own writing throughout the works that he produced. But particularly when he wrote A Christmas Carol, this theme of separation of death and this theme of those that had a wealth and those that did not, those that were poor, and the dire circumstances of what that social cataclysm could mean, were very predominant, and they create this added urgency within the message of this time of year and this memory of things that he was thinking about. Charles Dickens' own father at one point worked in one of these workhouses, And it left such a dire impression upon Charles Dickens that much later in his life, as he became a successful writer, he would often go out of his way to help those in need. He writes about it. He wrote very stridently against a lot of the social problems that were being had throughout Victorian England, those that were suffering as a result of this draconian law that on the surface sounded like it was offering aid, but it wasn't. And the separation of family, the need for families to stay together, the need for families to survive. These sorts of themes come out, and particularly in this moment of Christmas. And the reason why I'm bringing this up is I want you to think about some of that as I read this third stave of his A Christmas Carol, because it's going to present some themes that when I come through on the other end of this, I'm going to pull back into a thought that has been something that's been on my mind. And as I'm coming to the conclusion of this year with this podcast, I think this is going to be a fitting message, not only for this time of Christmas, for this time of giving, for this time of memory and the ghosts that are in our heart, for the people that we love that cannot abide with us now because they're physically not here, as well as the desires in our heart that maybe cannot be fulfilled, or the things that are troubling to us, even in this time of great joy. There's a rich detail of life, of people, of motion. And at the center of this is this message of the milk of human kindness, of which Charles Dickens writes so beautifully. And I want to present that now as the marination of what I want you to consider and feel as you listen to the words that Charles Dickens wrote, and then we'll go from there. That to remember that we are alive, yet now we are also in memory and in consideration of those that are long dead. This is a central theme of Christmas. As Virginia Woolf would say, life, London, this moment in June, or in this case, this moment in December. This is the moment now, and yet it's completely filled with this sense of what cannot be anymore, and how does it influence what we take care of now? Hopefully, those memories bring us a sense of greater contentment with the time that we have here and now, and what it is we are going to choose to do, not only with it for ourselves, but for those that we love and those that we see around us that may need all that we have. And if all that we have is just the time to share with somebody else, or the energy and the space that we provide, the sustenance of a thought, the emotional strength that we have in our heart, even when we ourselves probably don't feel that we have much to give, there is so much that can be offered in this sense of a greater hope for our humanity at this time of Christmas. And so with that, let me go ahead and I'm going to go ahead and turn to stave 3 of A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens, and we'll commence with the reading. On the flip side of this, I will talk with you again. Stave 3 of A Christmas Carol and Other Christmas Stories by Charles Dickens, the second of the three spirits. Awaking in the middle of a prodigiously tough snore, and sitting up in bed to get his thoughts together, Scrooge had no occasion to be told that the bell was again upon the stroke of 1. He felt that he was restored to consciousness in the right nick of time for the especial purpose of holding a conference with the second messenger dispatched to him through Jacob Marley's intervention. But finding that he turned uncomfortably cold when he began to wonder which of his curtains this new spectre would draw back, he put them every one aside with his own hands, and lying down again, established a sharp lookout all around the bed. for he wished to challenge the spirit on the moment of its appearance and did not wish to be taken by surprise and made nervous. Gentlemen of the free and easy sort, who plume themselves on being acquainted with a move or two, and being usually equal to the time of day, express the wide range of their capacity for adventure by observing that they are good for anything from pitch and toss to manslaughter, between which opposite extremes, no doubt, there lies a tolerably wide and comprehensive range of subjects. Without venturing for Scrooge quite as heartily as this, I don't mind calling on you to believe that he was ready for a good broad field of strange appearances, and that nothing between a baby and a rhinoceros would have astonished him very much. Now, being prepared for almost anything, he was not by any means prepared for nothing, and consequently, when the bell struck 1 and no shape appeared, he was taken with a violent fit of trembling. 5 minutes, 10 minutes, a quarter of an hour went by, yet nothing came. All this time he lay upon his bed, the very core and center of a blaze of ruddy light which streamed upon it when the clock proclaimed the hour, and which, being only light, was more alarming than a dozen ghosts, as he was powerless to make out what it meant, or would be at, and was sometimes apprehensive that he might be at that very moment an interesting case of spontaneous combustion, without having the consolation of knowing it. At last, however, he began to think, as you or I would have thought at first, for it is always the person not in the predicament who knows what ought to have been done in it, and would unquestionably have done it too. At last, I say, he began to think that the source and secret of this ghostly light might be in the adjoining room, from whence, on further tracing it, it seemed to shine. This idea taking full possession of his mind, he got up softly and shuffled in his slippers to the door. The moment Scrooge's hand was on the lock, a strange voice called him by his name and bade him enter it. He obeyed. It was his own room, there was no doubt about that, but it had undergone a surprising transformation. The walls and ceiling were so hung with living green that it looked a perfect grove, from every part of which bright, gleaming berries glistened. The crisp leaves of holly, mistletoe, and ivy reflected back the light, as if so many little mirrors had been scattered there, and such a mighty blaze went roaring up the chimney as that dull petrifaction of a hearth had never known in Scrooge's time, or Marley's, or for many a winter season gone. Heaped up on the floor to form a kind of throne were turkeys, geese, game, poultry, brawn, great joints of meat, sucking pigs, long wreaths of sausages, mince pies, plum puddings, barrels of oysters, red-hot chestnuts, cherry-cheeked apples, juicy oranges, luscious pears, immense twelfth cakes, and seething bowls of punch that made the chamber dim with their delicious steam. In easy state upon this couch there sat a jolly giant, glorious to see, who bore a glowing torch in shape not unlike Plenty's horn, and held it up, high up, to shed its light on Scrooge as he came peeping around the door. "Come in," exclaimed the ghost. "Come in, and know me better, man." Scrooge entered timidly and hung his head before this spirit. He was not the dogged Scrooge he had been, and though the spirit's eyes were clear and kind, he did not like to meet them. "I am the ghost of Christmas present," said the spirit. "Look upon me." Scrooge reverently did so. It was clothed in one simple, deep green robe or mantle bordered with white fur. This garment hung so loosely on the figure that its capacious breast was bare, as if disdaining to be warded or concealed by any artifice. Its feet, observable beneath the ample folds of the garment, were also bare, and on its head it wore no other covering than a holly wreath, set here and there with shining icicles. Its dark brown curls were long and free as its genial face, its sparkling eye, its open hand, its cheery voice, its unconstrained demeanor, and its joyful air. Girded round its middle was an antique scabbard, but no sword was in it, and the ancient sheath was eaten up with rust. "You have never seen the like of me before," exclaimed the spirit. "Never?" Scrooge made answer to it. "Have never walked forth with the younger members of my family, meaning, for I am very young, my elder brothers born in these latter years," pursued the phantom. "I don't think I have," said Scrooge. "I'm afraid I have not. Have you had many brothers, spirit?" "More than 1,800, said the ghost. "A tremendous family to provide for," muttered Scrooge. The ghost of Christmas present rose. "Spirit," said Scrooge submissively, "conduct me where you will. I went forth last night on compulsion, and I learned a lesson which is working now. Tonight, if you have aught to teach me, let me profit by it." "Touch my robe." Scrooge did as he was told, and held it fast. Holly, mistletoe, red berries, ivy, turkeys, geese, game, poultry, brawn, meat, pigs, sausages, oysters, pies, puddings, fruit, and punch all vanished instantly. So did the room, the fire, the ruddy glow, the hour of the night, and they stood in the city streets on Christmas morning, where, for the weather was severe, the people made a rough but brisk and not unpleasant kind of music, in scraping the snow from the pavement in front of their dwellings and from the tops of their houses, whence it was mad delight to the boys to see it come plumping down into the road below, and splitting into artificial little snowstorms. The house fronts looked black enough, and the windows blacker, contrasting with the smooth white sheet of snow upon the roofs, and with the dirtier snow upon the ground which last deposit had been plowed up in deep furrows by the heavy wheels of carts and wagons, furrows that crossed and recrossed each other hundreds of times, where the great streets branched off and made intricate channels hard to trace in the thick yellow mud and icy water. The sky was gloomy, and the shortest streets were choked up with a dingy mist, half thawed, half frozen, whose heavier particles descended in a shower of sooty atoms, as if all the chimneys in Great Britain had by one consent caught fire, and were blazing away to their dear hearts' content. There was nothing very cheerful in the climate or the town, and yet there was an air of cheerfulness abroad, that the clearest summer air and brightest summer sun might have endeavored to diffuse in vain. But the people who were shoveling away on the housetops were jovial and full of glee, calling out to one another from the parapets, and now and then exchanging a facetious snowball, better-natured missile far than many a wordy jest, laughing heartily if it went right, and not less heartily if it went wrong. The poulterers' shops were still half open, and the fruiterers were radiant with their glory. There were great, round, pot-bellied baskets of chestnuts, shaped like the waistcoats of jolly old gentlemen, lolling at the doors and tumbling out into the street in their apoplectic opulence. There were ruddy, brown-faced, broad-girthed Spanish onions, shining in the fatness of their growth like Spanish friars, and winking from their shelves in wanton slyness at the girls as they went by, and glanced demurely at the hung-up mistletoe. There were pears and apples clustered high in blooming pyramids. There were bunches of grapes made in the shopkeeper's benevolence to dangle from conspicuous hooks that people's mouths might water gratis as they passed. There were piles of filberts, mossy and brown, recalling in their fragrance ancient walks among the woods and pleasant shufflings ankle-deep through withered leaves. There were Norfolk biffins, squab and swarthy, setting off the yellow of the oranges and lemons, and in the great compactness of their juicy persons, urgently entreating and beseeching to be carried home in paper bags and eaten after dinner. The very gold and silver fish set forth among these choice fruits in a bowl through members of a dull and stagnant blooded race appeared to know that there was something going on, and to a fish went gasping round and round their little world in slow and passionless excitement. The grocers, nearly closed with perhaps 2 shutters down or 1, but through those gaps such glimpses. It was not alone that the scales descending on the counter made a merry sound, or that the twine and roller parted company so briskly, or that the canisters were rattled up and down like juggling tricks, or even that the blended scents of tea and coffee were so grateful to the nose, or even that the raisins were so plentiful and rare, the almonds so extremely white, the sticks of cinnamon so long and straight, the other spices so delicious, the candied fruits so caked and spotted with molten sugar as to make the coldest lookers-on feel faint and subsequently bilious. Nor was it that the figs were moist and pulpy, or that the French plums blushed in modest tartness from their highly decorated boxes, or that everything was good to eat and in its Christmas dress, but the customers were all so hurried and so eager in the hopeful promise of the day that they tumbled up against each other at the door, crashing their wicker baskets wildly, and left their purchases upon the counter, and came running back to fetch them, and committed hundreds of the like mistakes in the best humor possible, while the grocer and his people were so frank and fresh that the polished hearts with which they fastened their aprons behind might have been their own, worn outside for general inspection and for Christmas daws to peck at if they chose. But soon the steeples called good people all to church and chapel, and away they came, flocking through the streets in their best clothes and with their gayest faces. And at the same time there emerged from scores of by-streets, lanes, and nameless turnings innumerable people carrying their dinners to the bakers' shops. The sight of these poor revelers appeared to interest the spirit very much, for he stood with Scrooge beside him in a baker's doorway, and taking off the covers as their bearers passed, sprinkled incense on their dinners from his torch. And it was a very uncommon kind of torch, for once or twice, when there were angry words between some dinner carriers who had jostled each other, he shed a few drops of water on them from it, and their good humor was restored directly. For they said, "It was a shame to quarrel upon Christmas Day," and so it was. God love it, so it was. In time the bells ceased and the bakers were shut up. And yet there was a genial shadowing forth of all these dinners and the progress of their cooking in the thawed blotch of wet above each baker's oven, where the pavement smoked as if its stones were cooking too. "Is there a peculiar flavor in what you sprinkle from your torch?" asked Scrooge. "There is, my own." "Would it apply to any kind of dinner on this day?" asked Scrooge. "To any kindly given. To a poor one most." "Why to a poor one most?" asked Scrooge. "Because he needs it most." "Spirit," said Scrooge after a moment's thought, "I wonder you, of all the beings in the many worlds about us, should desire to cramp these people's opportunities of innocent enjoyment." "Aye," cried the spirit. "You would deprive them of their means of dining every seventh day, often the only day on which they can be said to dine at all," said Scrooge. "Wouldn't you?" "Aye," cried the spirit. "You seek to close these places on the seventh day," said Scrooge, "and it comes to the same thing." "I seek," exclaimed the spirit. "Forgive me if I am wrong. It has been done in your name, or at least in that of your family," said Scrooge. "There are some upon this earth of yours," returned the spirit, "who claim to know us, and who do their deeds of passion, pride, ill will, hatred, envy, bigotry, and selfishness in their name, in our name, who are as strange to us, and all our kith and kin, as if they had never lived. Remember that, and charge their doings on themselves, not us." Scrooge promised that he would, and they went on, invisible as they had been before, into the suburbs of the town. It was a remarkable quality of the ghost which Scrooge had observed at the baker's, that notwithstanding his gigantic size, he could accommodate himself to any place with ease, and that he stood beneath a low roof quite as gracefully and like a supernatural creature as it was possible he could have done in any lofty hall. And perhaps it was the pleasure the good spirit had in showing off this power of his, or else it was his own kind, generous, hardy nature, and his sympathy with all poor men that led him straight to Scrooge's clerks. For there he went, and took Scrooge with him, holding to his robe, and on the threshold of the door the spirit smiled, and stopped to bless Bob Cratchit's dwelling with the sprinklings of his torch. Think of that. Bob had but 15 bob a week himself. He pocketed on Saturdays but 15 copies of his Christian name, and yet the ghost of Christmas present blessed his 4-roomed house. Then up rose Mrs. Cratchit, Cratchit's wife, dressed out but poorly, in a twice-turned gown, but brave in ribbons, which are cheap, and make a goodly show for 6 pence, and she laid the cloth, assisted by Belinda Cratchit, second of the daughters, also brave in ribbons, while Master Peter Cratchit plunged a fork into the saucepan of potatoes, and getting the corners of his monstrous shirt-collar, Bob's private property, conferred upon his son and heir in the honor of the day, into his mouth, rejoiced to find himself so gallantly attired, and yearned to show his linen in the fashionable parks. And now 2 smaller Cratchits, boy and girl, came tearing in, screaming that outside the baker's they had smelled the goose and known it for their own, and basking in luxurious thoughts of sage and onion, these young Cratchits danced about the table and exalted Master Peter Cratchit to the skies, while he, not proud, although his collars nearly choked him, blew the fire until the slow potatoes, bubbling up, knocked loudly at the saucepan lid to be let out and peeled. "What has ever got your precious father, then?" said Mrs. Cratchit. "And your brother, Tiny Tim, and Martha, warn't as late last Christmas by half an hour." "Here's Martha, mother," said the girl, appearing as she spoke. "Here's Martha, mother," cried the young Cratchits. "Hooray! There's such a goose, Martha." "Why, bless your heart alive, my dear, how late you are," said Mrs. Cratchit, kissing her a dozen times and taking off her shawl and bonnet for her with officious zeal. "We'd a deal of work to finish up last night," replied the girl, "and to clear away this morning, mother." "Well, never mind so long as you are come," said Mrs. Cratchit. "Sit ye down here before the fire, my dear, and have a warm. Lord bless ye." "No, no, there's father coming," cried the two young Cratchits, who were everywhere at once. "Hide, Martha, hide." So Martha hid herself, and in came little Bob, the father, with at least 3 feet of comforter, exclusive of the fringe hanging down before him, and his threadbare clothes darned up and brushed to look seasonable, and Tiny Tim upon his shoulder. Alas for Tiny Tim, he bore a little crutch, and had his limbs supported by an iron frame. "Why, there's our Martha," cried Bob Cratchit, looking round. "Not coming," said Mrs. Cratchit. "Not coming," said Bob, with a sudden declension in his high spirits, for he had been Tim's blood horse all the way from church, and had come home rampant. "Not coming upon Christmas Day?" Martha didn't like to see him disappointed, if it were only a joke, so she came out prematurely from behind the closet door and ran into his arms, while the two young Cratchits hustled Tiny Tim and bore him off into the wash-house, that he might hear the pudding singing in the copper. "And how did little Tim behave?" asked Mrs. Cratchit, when she had rallied Bob on his credulity, and Bob had hugged his daughter to his heart's content. "As good as gold," said Bob, "and better. Somehow he gets thoughtful, sitting by himself so much, and thinks the strangest things you ever heard. He told me coming home that he hoped the people saw him in the church because he was a cripple, and it might be pleasant to them to remember upon Christmas Day, who made lame beggars walk and blind men see." Bob's voice was tremulous when he told them this, and trembled more when he said that Tiny Tim was growing strong and hearty. His active little crutch was heard upon the floor, and back came Tiny Tim before another word was spoken, escorted by his brother and sister to his stool beside the fire, and while Bob, turning up his cuffs as if, poor fellow, they were capable of being made more shabby, compounded some hot mixture in a jug with gin and lemons, and stirred it round and put it on the hob to simmer, Master Peter and the two ubiquitous young Cratchits went to fetch the goose, with which they soon returned in high procession. Such a bustle ensued that you might have thought a goose the rarest of all birds, a feathered phenomenon to which a black swan was a matter of course, and in truth it was something very like it in that house. Mrs. Cratchit made the gravy, ready beforehand in a little saucepan, hissing hot. Master Peter mashed the potatoes with incredible vigor. Miss Belinda sweetened up the applesauce. Martha dusted the hot plates. Bob took Tiny Tim beside him in a tiny corner at the table. The two young Cratchits set chairs for everybody, not forgetting themselves, and mounting guard upon their posts, crammed spoons into their mouths lest they should shriek for goose before their turn came to be helped. At last the dishes were set on, and grace was said. It was succeeded by a breathless pause, as Mrs. Cratchit, looking slowly all along the carving knife, prepared to plunge it in the breast. But when she did, and when the long-expected gush of stuffing issued forth, one murmur of delight arose all round the board, and even Tiny Tim, excited by the two young Cratchits, beat on the table with the handle of his knife, and feebly cried, "Hooray!" There was never such a goose. Bob said he didn't believe there ever was such a goose cooked. Its tenderness and flavor, size and cheapness were the themes of universal admiration. Eked out by applesauce and mashed potatoes, it was a sufficient dinner for the whole family. Indeed, as Mrs. Cratchit said with great delight, surveying one small atom of a bone upon the dish, "They hadn't ate it all at last. Every one had enough, and the youngest Cratchits in particular were steeped in sage and onion to the eyebrows. But now the plates were being changed by Miss Belinda. Miss Cratchit left the room alone, too nervous to bear witness, to take the pudding up and bring it in. Suppose it should not be done enough. Suppose it should break in turning out. Suppose somebody should have got over the wall of the backyard and stolen it, while they were merry with the goose. A supposition at which the two young Cratchits became livid. All sorts of horrors were supposed. Hallo! A great deal of steam. The pudding was out of the copper. A smell like a washing day. That was the cloth. A smell like an eating house and a pastry cook's next door to each other, with a laundress's next door to that. That was the pudding. In half a minute, Mrs. Cratchit entered flushed, but smiling proudly with the pudding like a speckled cannonball so hard and firm, blazing in half a quartern of ignited brandy, and bedight with Christmas holly stuck into the top. Oh, a wonderful pudding, Bob Cratchit said, and calmly, too, that he regarded it as the greatest success achieved by Mrs. Cratchit since their marriage. Mrs. Cratchit said that now that the weight was off her mind, she would confess she had her doubts about the quantity of flour. Everybody had something to say about it, but nobody said or thought it was at all a small pudding for a large family. It would have been flat hearsay to do so. Any Cratchit would have blushed to hint at such a thing. At last the dinner was all done. The cloth was cleared, the hearth swept, and the fire made up. The compound in the jug being tasted and considered perfect, apples and oranges were put upon the table, and a shovelful of chestnuts on the fire. Then all the Cratchit family drew round the hearth in what Bob Cratchit called a circle, meaning half a one, and at Bob Cratchit's elbow stood the family display of glass, 2 tumblers and a custard cup without a handle. These held the hot stuff from the jug, however, as well as golden goblets would have done, and Bob served it out with beaming looks, while the chestnuts on the fire sputtered and crackled noisily. Then Bob proposed, "A Merry Christmas to us all, my dears. God bless us," which all the family re-echoed. "God bless us, every one," said Tiny Tim, the last of all. He sat very close to his father's side upon his little stool. Bob held his withered little hand in his, as if he loved the child and wished to keep him by his side, and dreaded that he might be taken from him. "Spirit," said Scrooge with an interest that he had never felt before, "tell me if Tiny Tim will live." "I see a vacant seat," replied the ghost, "in the poor chimney corner, and a crutch without an owner, carefully preserved. If these shadows remain unaltered by the future, the child will die." "No, no," said Scrooge. "Oh, no, kind spirit, say he will be spared." "If these shadows remain unaltered by the future, none other of my race," returned the ghost, "will find him here. What then? If he be like to die, he had better do it, and decrease the population." Scrooge hung his head to hear his own words quoted by the spirit, and was overcome with penitence and grief. "Man," said the ghost, "if man be in heart not adamant, forbear that wicked cant, until you have discovered what the surplus is, and where it is. Will you decide what men shall live, what men shall die? It may be that in the sight of heaven you are more worthless and less fit to live than millions like this poor man's child. O God, to hear the insect on the leaf pronouncing on the too much life among his hungry brothers in the dust." Scrooge bent before the ghost's rebuke, and trembling cast his eyes upon the ground, but he raised them speedily on hearing his own name. "Mr. Scrooge," said Bob. "I'll give you Mr. Scrooge, the founder of the feast." "Founder of the feast, indeed," cried Mrs. Cratchit, reddening. "I wish I had him here. I'd give him a piece of my mind to feast upon, and I hope he'd have a good appetite for it." "My dear," said Bob, "the children, Christmas Day." "It should be Christmas Day, I'm sure," said she, "on which one drinks to the health of such an odious, stingy, hard, unfeeling man as Mr. Scrooge. You know he is, Robert. Nobody knows it better than you do, poor fellow." "My dear," was Bob's mild answer, "Christmas Day. I'll drink to his health for your sake." "And the day's," said Mrs. Cratchit. "Not for his. Long life to him. A Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. He'll be very merry and very happy, I have no doubt." The children drank the toast after her. It was the first of their proceedings which had no heartiness in it. Tiny Tim drank it last of all, but he didn't care 2 pence for it. Scrooge was the ogre of the family. The mention of his name cast a dark shadow on the party, which was not dispelled for full 5 minutes. After it had passed away, they were 10 times merrier than before, from the mere relief of Scrooge, the baleful, being done with. Bob Cratchit told them how he had a situation in his eye for Master Peter, which would bring in, if obtained, full 5 and 6 pence weekly. The 2 young Cratchits laughed tremendously at the idea of Peter's being a man of business, and Peter himself looked thoughtfully at the fire from between his collars, as if he were deliberating what particular investments he should favor when he came into the receipt of that bewildering income. Martha, who was a poor apprentice at a milliner's, then told them what kind of work she had to do, and how many hours she worked at a stretch, and how she meant to lie abed tomorrow morning for a good long rest, tomorrow being a holiday she passed at home. Also, how she had seen a countess and a lord some days before, and how the lord was much about as tall as Peter, at which Peter pulled up his collars so high that you couldn't have seen his head if you had been there. All this time the chestnuts and the jug went round, and by they had a song about a lost child traveling in the snow from Tiny Tim, who had a plaintive little voice, and sang it very well indeed. There was nothing of high mark in this. They were not a handsome family. They were not well dressed. Their shoes were far from being waterproof, their clothes were scanty, and Peter might have known, and very likely did, the inside of a pawnbroker's. But they were happy, grateful, pleased with one another, and contented with the time. And when they faded, and looked happier yet in the bright sprinklings of the Spirit's torch at parting, Scrooge had his eye upon them, and especially on Tiny Tim, until the last. By this time it was getting dark, and snowing pretty heavily, and as Scrooge and the Spirit went along the streets, the brightness of the roaring fires in kitchens, parlors, and all sorts of rooms was wonderful. Here the flickering of the blaze showed preparations for a cozy dinner, with hot plates baking through and through before the fire, and deep red curtains ready to be drawn to shut out cold and darkness. There all the children of the house were running out into the snow to meet their married sisters, brothers, cousins, uncles, aunts, and to be the first to greet them. Here, again, were shadows on the window blinds of guests assembling, and there a group of handsome girls, all hooded and fur-booted, and all chattering at once, tripped lightly off to some near neighbor's house, where woe upon the single man who saw them enter. Artful witches, well they knew it, in a glow. But if you had judged from the numbers of people on their way to friendly gatherings, you might have thought that no one was at home to give them welcome when they got there, instead of every house expecting company and piling up its fires half chimney high. Blessings on it, how the ghost exulted, how it bared its breadth of breast, and opened its capacious palm, and floated on outpouring with a generous hand its bright and harmless mirth on everything within its reach. The very lamplighter who ran on before, dotting the dusky street with specks of light, and who was dressed to spend the evening somewhere, laughed out loudly as the Spirit passed, though little kenned the lamplighter that he had any company but Christmas. And now, without a word of warning from the ghost, they stood upon a bleak and desert moor, where monstrous masses of rude stone were cast about, as though it were the burial place of giants, and water spread itself wheresoever it listed. It would have done so, but for the frost that held it prisoner, and nothing grew but moss and furze and coarse, rank grass. Down in the west, the setting sun had left a streak of fiery red, which glared upon the desolation for an instant like a sullen eye, and frowning lower, lower, lower yet, was lost in the thick gloom of darkest night. "What place is this?" asked Scrooge. "A place where miners live, who labor in the bowels of the earth," returned the Spirit. "But they know me. See." A light shone from the window of a hut, and swiftly they advanced toward it. Passing through the wall of mud and stone, they found a cheerful company assembled round a glowing fire, an old man and woman, with their children and their children's children, and another generation beyond that, all decked out gaily in their holiday attire. The old man, in a voice that seldom rose above the howling of the wind upon the barren waste, was singing them a Christmas song, and it had been a very old song when he was a boy, and from time to time they all joined in the chorus. So surely as they raised their voices, the old man got quite blithe and loud, and so surely as they stopped, his vigor sank again. The Spirit did not tarry here, but bade Scrooge hold his robe, and passing on above the moor, sped whither? Not to sea, to sea. To Scrooge's horror, looking back, he saw the last of the land, a frightful range of rocks behind them, and his ears were deafened by the thundering of water, as it rolled and roared and raged among the dreadful caverns it had worn, and fiercely tried to undermine the earth. Built upon a dismal reef of sunken rocks some leagues or so from shore, on which the waters chafed and dashed, the wild year through there stood a solitary lighthouse. Great heaps of seaweed clung to its base, and storm birds born of the wind, one might suppose a seaweed of the water, rose and fell about it, like the waves they skimmed. But even here, two men who watched the light had made a fire, that through the loophole in the thick stone wall shed out a ray of brightness on the awful sea. Joining their horny hands over the rough table at which they sat, they wished each other Merry Christmas in their can of grog, and one of them, the elder two, with his face all damaged and scarred with hard weather, as the figurehead of an old ship might be, struck up a sturdy song that was like a gale in itself. Again the ghost sped on, above the black and heaving sea, on, until being far away, as he told Scrooge from any shore, they lighted on a ship. They stood beside the helmsman at the wheel, the lookout in the bow, the officers who had the watch, dark, ghostly figures in their several stations, but every man among them hummed a Christmas tune, or had a Christmas thought, or spoke below his breath to his companion of some bygone Christmas day, with homeward hopes belonging to it. And every man on board, waking or sleeping, good or bad, had had a kinder word for one another on that day in the year, and had shared to some extent in its festivities, and had remembered those he cared for at a distance, and had known that they delighted to remember him. It was a great surprise to Scrooge, while listening to the moaning of the wind and thinking what a solemn thing it was to move on through the lonely darkness over an unknown abyss, whose depths were secrets as profound as death. It was a great surprise to Scrooge, while thus engaged, to hear a hearty laugh. It was a much greater surprise to Scrooge to recognize it as his own nephew's, and to find himself in a bright, dry, gleaming room, with the spirit standing smiling by his side, and looking at that same nephew with approving affability. Laughed Scrooge's nephew. If you should happen by any unlikely chance to know a man more blessed in a laugh than Scrooge's nephew, all I can say is I should like to know him too. Introduce him to me, and I'll cultivate his acquaintance. It is a fair, even-handed, noble adjustment of things that while there is infection and disease and sorrow, there is nothing in the world so irresistibly contagious as laughter and good humor. When Scrooge's nephew laughed in this way, holding his sides, rolling his head, and twisting his face into the most extravagant contortions, Scrooge's niece by marriage laughed as heartily as he, and their assembled friends, being not a bit behindhand, roared out lustily, "He said that Christmas was a humbug. As I live," cried Scrooge's nephew, "he believed it too." "More shame for him, Fred," said Scrooge's niece indignantly. "Bless those women, they never do anything by halves. They are always in earnest." She was very pretty, exceedingly pretty, with a ripe, dimpled, surprised-looking capital face, a ripe little mouth that seemed made to be kissed, as no doubt it was, all kinds of good little dots about her chin that melted into one another when she laughed, and the sunniest pair of eyes you ever saw in any little creature's head. Altogether, she was what you would have called provoking, but satisfactory, too. Oh, perfectly satisfactory. "He's a comical old fellow," said Scrooge's nephew. "That's the truth, and not so pleasant as he might be. However, his offences carry their own punishment, and I have nothing to say against him." "I'm sure he is very rich, Fred," hinted Scrooge's niece. "At least you always tell me so." "What of that, my dear?" said Scrooge's nephew. "His wealth is of no use to him. He doesn't do any good with it. He doesn't make himself comfortable with it. He hasn't the satisfaction of thinking, that he is ever going to benefit us with it." "I have no patience with him," observed Scrooge's niece. Scrooge's niece's sisters and all the other ladies expressed the same opinion. "Oh, I have," said Scrooge's nephew. "I'm sorry for him. I couldn't be angry with him if I tried. Who suffers by his ill whims? Himself always. Here. He takes it into his head to dislike us, and he won't come and dine with us. What's the consequence? He doesn't lose much of a dinner." "Indeed, I think he loses a very good dinner," interrupted Scrooge's niece. Everybody else said the same, and they must be allowed to have been competent judges because they had just had dinner, and with the dessert upon the table were clustered round the fire by lamplight. "Well, I'm very glad to hear it," said Scrooge's nephew, "because I haven't any great faith in these young housekeepers. What do you say, Topper?" Topper had clearly got his eye upon one of Scrooge's niece's sisters, for he answered that a bachelor was a wretched outcast who had no right to express an opinion on the subject, whereat Scrooge's niece's sister, the plump one with the lace tucker, not the one with the roses, blushed. "Do go on, Fred," said Scrooge's niece, clapping her hands. "He never finishes what he begins to say. He is such a ridiculous fellow." Scrooge's nephew revelled in another laugh, and as it was impossible to keep the infection off, though the plump sister tried hard to do it with aromatic vinegar, his example was unanimously followed.
"I was only going to say," said Scrooge's nephew, "that the consequence of his taking a dislike to us and not making merry with us is, as I think, that he loses some pleasant moments which could do him no harm. I am sure he loses pleasanter companions than he can find in his own thoughts, either in his mouldy old office or his dusty chambers. I mean to give him the same chance every year, whether he likes it or not, for I pity him. He may rail at Christmas time till he dies, but he can't help thinking better of it. I defy him if he finds me going there in good temper year after year and saying, 'Uncle Scrooge, how are you?' If it only puts him in the vein to leave his poor clerk £50, that's something. And I think I shook him yesterday." It was their turn to laugh now at the notion of his shaking Scrooge, but being thoroughly good-natured and not much caring what they laughed at, so that they laughed at any rate, he encouraged them in their merriment and passed the bottle joyously. After tea they had some music, for they were a musical family and knew what they were about. When they sung a glee or catch, I can assure you, especially Topper, who could growl away in the bass like a good one and never swell the large veins in his forehead or get red in the face over it. Scrooge's niece played well upon the harp, and played among other tunes a simple little air, a mere nothing. You might learn to whistle it in 2 minutes, which had been familiar to the child who fetched Scrooge from the boarding-house, as he had been reminded by the ghost of Christmas past. When the strain of music sounded, all the things that Ghost had showed him came up again in his mind. He softened more and more, and thought that if he could have listened to it often years ago, he might have cultivated the kindness of life for his own happiness with his own hands, without resorting to the sexton's spade that buried Jacob Marley. But they didn't devote the whole evening to music. After a while they played at fourfoots. For it is good to be children sometimes, and never better than at Christmas, when its mighty founder was a child himself. Stop! There was first a game at blind men's buff. Of course there was. And no more believe Topper was really blind than I believe he had his eyes in his boots. My opinion is that it was a done thing between him and Scrooge's nephew, and that the ghost of Christmas present knew it. The way he went after that plump sister and the lace tucker was an outrage on the credulity of human nature, knocking down the fire irons, tumbling over the chairs, bumping up against the piano, smothering himself among the curtains whenever she went. There went he. He always knew where the plump sister was. He wouldn't catch anybody else. If you had fallen up against him, as some of them did, on purpose, he would have made a feint of endeavoring to seize you, which would have been an affront to your understanding and would instantly have sidled off in the direction of the plump sister. She often cried out that it wasn't fair, and it really was not. But when at last he caught her, when in spite of all her silken rustlings and her rapid flutterings past him, he got her into a corner whence there was no escape, then his conduct was the most execrable. For his pretending not to know her, his pretending that it was necessary to touch her headdress, and further to assure himself of her identity by pressing a certain ring upon her finger and a certain chain about her neck, was vile, monstrous. No doubt. She told him her opinion of it when another blind man being in office, they were so very confidential together behind the curtains. Scrooge's niece was not one of the blindman's buff's party, but was made comfortable with a large chair and a footstool in a snug corner, where the ghost and Scrooge were close behind her. But she joined in the fourfoots and loved her love to admiration with all the letters of the alphabet. Likewise, at the game of how, when, and where, she was very great, and to the secret joy of Scrooge's nephew, beat her sisters hollow, though they were sharp girls too, as Topper could have told you. There might have been 20 people there, young and old, but they all played, and so did Scrooge, for wholly forgetting in the interest he had in what was going on, that his voice made no sound in their ears, but he sometimes came out with his guess quite loud, and very often guessed right too, for the sharpest needle, best Whitechapel, warranted not to cut in the eye, was not sharper than Scrooge, blunt as he took it in his head to be. The ghost was greatly pleased to find him in this mood, and looked upon him with such a favor that he begged like a boy to be allowed to stay until the guests departed. But this, the spirit said, could not be done. "Here is a new game," said Scrooge. "1 half-hour, spirit, only one." It was a game called Yes and No, where Scrooge's nephew had to think of something, and the rest must find out what, he only answering to their questions yes or no, as the case was.
The brisk fire of questioning to which he was exposed elicited from him that he was thinking of an animal, a live animal, a rather disagreeable animal, a savage animal, an animal that growled and grunted sometimes and talked sometimes and lived in London and walked about the streets and wasn't made a show of and wasn't led by anybody and didn't live in a menagerie and was never killed in a market and was not a horse or an ass or a cow or a bull or a tiger or a dog or a pig or a cat or a bear. At every fresh question that was put to him, this nephew burst into a fresh roar of laughter and was so inexpressibly tickled that he was obliged to get up off the sofa and stamp. At last the plump sister, falling into a similar state, cried out, "I have found it out! I know what it is, Fred! I know what it is!" "What is it?" cried Fred. "It's your Uncle Scrooge!" Which it certainly was. Admiration was the universal sentiment, though some objected that the reply to, "Is it a bear?" ought to have been yes, inasmuch as an answer in the negative was sufficient to have diverted their thoughts from Mr. Scrooge, supposing they had ever had any tendency that way. "He has given us plenty of merriment, I am sure," said Fred, "and it would be ungrateful not to drink his health. Here is a glass of mulled wine ready to our hand at the moment, and I say, Uncle Scrooge." "Well, Uncle Scrooge," they cried, "a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year to the old man, whatever he is," said Scrooge's nephew. "He wouldn't take it from me, but may have it nevertheless. Uncle Scrooge!" Uncle Scrooge had imperceptibly become so gay and light of heart that he would have pledged the unconscious company in return and thanked them in an inaudible speech if the ghost had given him time. But the whole scene passed off in the breath of the last words spoken by his nephew, and he and the spirit were again upon their travels. Much they say, and far they went, and many homes they visited, but always with a happy end. The spirit stood beside sick beds, and they were cheerful. On foreign lands, they were close at home. By struggling men, and they were patient in their greater hope. By poverty, and it was rich. In almshouse, hospital, and jail, in misery's every refuge, where vain man in his little brief authority had not made fast the door, and barred the spirit out, he left his blessing and taught Scrooge his precepts. It was a long night, if it were only a night, but Scrooge had his doubts of this, because the Christmas holidays appeared to be condensed into the space of time they passed together. It was strange, too, that while Scrooge remained unaltered in his outward form, the ghost grew older, clearly older. Scrooge had observed this change, but never spoke of it, until they left a children's 12th night party. When looking at the spirit as they stood together in an open place, he noticed that its hair was gray. "Are spirits' lives so short?" asked Scrooge. "My life upon this globe is very brief," replied the ghost. "It ends tonight." "Tonight?" cried Scrooge. "Tonight at midnight. Hark, the time is drawing near." The chimes were ringing, the 11:15 at that moment. "Forgive me if I'm not justified in what I ask," said Scrooge, looking intently at the spirit's robe, "but I see something strange and not belonging to yourself protruding from your skirts. Is it a foot or a claw?" "It might be a claw, or the flesh there is upon it," was the spirit's sorrowful reply. "Look here." From the foldings of its robe it brought two children, wretched, abject, frightful, hideous, miserable. They knelt down at his feet and clung upon the outside of its garment. "Oh, man, look here. Look down here," exclaimed the ghost. They were a boy and a girl, yellow, meager, ragged, scowling, wolfish, but prostrate, too, in their humility. Where graceful youth should have filled their features out and touched them with its freshest tints, a stale and shriveled hand, like that of age, had pinched and twisted them and pulled them into shreds. Where angels might have sat enthroned, devils lurked and glared out menacing. No change, no degradation, no perversion of humanity in any grade. Through all the mysteries of wonderful creation has monsters half so horrible and dread. Scrooge started back, appalled. Having them shown to him in this way, he tried to say they were fine children, but the words choked themselves rather than be parties to a lie of such enormous magnitude. "Spirit, are they yours?" Scrooge could say no more. "They are man's," said the spirit, looking down upon them, "and they cling to me, appealing from their fathers. This boy is ignorance, this girl is want. Beware of them both, and all that agree, but most of all beware this boy. For on his brow I see the written which is doom. Unless the writing be erased, deny it, cried the spirit, stretching out his hand toward the city. Slander those who tell it ye. Admit it for your factious purposes, and make it worse, and bide the end.
Have they no refuge or resource? Cried Scrooge.
What? Are there no prisons? Said the spirit, turning on him for the last time with his own words. Are there no workhouses? The bell struck 12. Scrooge looked about him for the ghost and saw it not. As the last stroke ceased to vibrate, he remembered the prediction of old Jacob Marley, and lifting up his eyes beheld a solemn phantom, draped and hooded, coming, like a mist along the ground, toward him. And thus, and here I will conclude the reading of Charles Dickens. That was stave 3 of A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens. I read that for a few reasons. I'm going to share a few of those with you here. Some I'm not going to mention. I'll just hopefully hope that there were some things that you noticed in listening to that. And as I do in this podcast, anything that I do read that is not of my own, I do welcome you to take the full advantage to hold that book in your hands yourself and read it. This is one that is worth reading and rereading, and obviously continues to tarry with us all these many years after it's been written because of the power of its spirit and its humanity. The second of the 3 ghosts is the ghost of Christmas Present. He's my favorite. And he is, in many ways, the spirit as a reference to God, but also something that I would say is maybe more human as well, whether it be God or not. And I like that Charles Dickens, when he wrote that, leaves that rather mysterious. There are a few considerations that I observed as I reread this in preparation to reading this tonight on this podcast. And there are a few things I want to just pull out, if you'll forgive me for doing so. And in no particular order. There was a phrase at the Cratchit home in the description of the meal that was being prepared. The beauty of it, the closeness and the comfort that was there. And the phrase was sweetened the applesauce. I don't know if you noticed that, but there's an intimacy and a closeness of the common and extraordinary reality of something as simple as sweetening the applesauce. Think about applesauce that you've had before. It's a common thing that we eat on a pretty regular basis. But in that moment, I think about that family, the Cratchit family, what a delight that applesauce would have been, and to have it sweetened unto from what it was. What a treat that would have been. I think of the moment of little Bob sitting with Tiny Tim at the hearth, and the dread of losing Tim, as Dickens describes it, the sentiment of Bob by that hearth with his little son, which goes back to this Christmas theme of death and of life. And my feelings as I thought about that and I read that, I thought of my own children, all 3 of them, my daughter and my 2 sons. I think about my youngest son, particularly in that setting, only because of his smallness, so in likening him to Tiny Tim, but all of them I would think equally in this way. My feelings with my children, and in consideration of my little boy, Dylan, in that moment, thinking of how much I love all 3 of those kids, and the idea in a moment sitting at the hearth, as Bob did, and seeing his little son, Tiny Tim, in the ailments that he had, the fear, in the thought in that moment of the life and the vitality of that moment, but knowing the specter of death was just there too. It's pretty sobering. And yet to be contented with the time, which the Cratchits were contented. Such beauty in that description. I've read a lot of things in my life, but that sequence, that setting is one of my favorites, and it's just absolutely magnificent in its simplicity. I thought of the sequence of the hardened men out at sea in the rough places, and yet they had thoughts of Christmas. These hardened men sharing Christmas wishes with each other over their cans of grog. The lonely darkness over an unknown abyss whose depths were secrets as profound as death. At sea, the sound of Scrooge's nephew's laughter that brings him from that dark place of abyss and wet and depth back to home. There is nothing in this world so irresistibly contagious as laughter and good humor. The nephew, who is thoroughly good-natured, and he passed the bottle joyously. How often have we passed the bottle joyously? As a metaphor, but in reality too. It doesn't matter what the bottle is. Have we passed it? Have we passed it joyously with those around us? And not just the bottle, but the mirth and the energy and the vitality of our present right now to somebody else who maybe they are laughing in that moment, but in their hearts they are hurting, and we give them something they didn't have before. The strain of music that sounded, the sound that brought Scrooge to a remembrance of all the things that he cherished and yet had allowed himself to forget. Where vain man in his little, brief authority. What a powerful, partial phrase. Where vain man in his little, brief authority. How often we think our lives are so important, and yet we have just this little, brief authority, which is really a nothing. It's a drop in the bucket. My favorite adaptation of this wonderful work by Charles Dickens in film, and I've spoken of this before, is the 1970 version entitled Scrooge. It was directed by Ronald Neame, and the entire film was written by Leslie Bricusse, who not only wrote the dialogue, but he did the amazing music. And I have said this for years. My mom gets credit for this. As a little boy, if there was ever a tradition in the Staker home, we, from the earliest that I can remember, we watched that movie on Christmas Eve. And that has become my favorite part of Christmas every year, is watching that movie. Albert Finney plays Scrooge, Sir Alec Guinness plays Jacob Marley, and Sir Kenneth More plays the ghost of Christmas Present. It is absolutely perfect. And I've said this for years. If Charles Dickens were alive, in my humble opinion, this would be the version that I think would be truest to what he was writing. And I think he would have been absolutely thrilled to see that adaptation. If you have not seen the 1970 Scrooge, directed by Ronald Neame and written by Leslie Bricusse with the music, whatever you do this Christmas, please go see it. You can get it on Prime. You can order a digital copy of it. But again, it's Scrooge 1970 with Albert Finney, and it will change your life. I promise you it will. When Sir Kenneth More, who plays the ghost of Christmas Present, in his towering opulence, with this great green robe and this holly wreath wrapped about his head and this full, vibrant beard, brings Scrooge, played by Albert Finney, back to his counting house. The sequence in the film, the exchange, is adapted just a little bit from what we just read, and it's beautiful. And the ghost of Christmas Present, he says, "Yes, Scrooge, I have brought you home." And his hand is open to the house. "You're not going?" "My time upon this little planet, 'tis very brief. I must leave you now." "But we still have so much to talk about, haven't we?" "There is never enough time to do or say all the things that we would wish. The thing is to try and do as much as you can in the time that you have." "Yes, but remember, Scrooge," and this is where the ghost of Christmas Present, Kenneth More, points his prodigious finger as he towers above this humbled miser, played by Albert Finney. "Time is short, and suddenly you're not there anymore." On the morning of Christmas, after Scrooge has gone through the next visitation with the ghost of Christmas Future, Ebenezer Scrooge is transformed, and we find him at the toy shop, where the owner Pringle is flummoxed by this sudden and inexplicable change that he sees in Scrooge. And he asks Scrooge hesitantly, "Mr. Scrooge, what has happened?" And Scrooge replies, Well, what's happened is perfectly simple, Pringle. I've discovered that I like life." In the simplest way, that's where I will end tonight. Because the idea that I started with tonight, and I hope I've connected this, I feel in my heart that maybe I have. I've made sense of this more for myself in the production of what I've been speaking tonight, and I hope it's connected for you, is that the moment here, the idea that what I've discovered, what we all hopefully discover, is that I like life, is to be contented with the time that we have now, here and now, and particularly at this time of Christmas. There are a lot of philosophies and ideas and things to be considered at this time, and they're all worthy in the sense if they reach to the idea of helping our humanity be better, to be kinder, to be more gentle, to be more selfless and thoughtful. The idea is to be content with what it is we have, not what we have not. For those that are not with us anymore, for the sense of death, for the sense of fear, for the sense of the unknown, that somehow, in the contentment of what it is we do have, in the power of the humanity and the idea of the briefness of this moment, that it's enough to give us the courage to continue on and to tell ourselves, even if we don't feel it all the time, that I like life. And though I cannot sing, I'm going to actually sing the song I Like Life, which Leslie Brickus wrote and is done so beautifully in the 1970s Scrooge. And with that, I will say Merry Christmas to each and every one of you. Thank you for being a listener to These Small Hours podcast. Next year, there is a lot coming I've already talked about in previous podcasts, but I will conclude this year with this song, and I send you my very best. And I hope that you and your families gather, be mindful of those that you have, be contented with the time here and now at this time of Christmas. And remember, those that aren't with us anymore, though they be shadows in our memories, they are with us also. And I believe we be with them. And I say this with just a joy of spirit, and Merry Christmas to each and every one of you. I like life, life likes me. Life and I fairly fully agree. Life is fine, life is good, especially mine, which is just as it should be. I like pouring the wine, and why not? Life's a pleasure that I deny not. I like life here and now. Life and I made a mutual vow. Till I die, life and I will both try to be better somehow. And if life were a woman, she would be my wife. Why? Because I like life. I like life, life likes me. I make life a perpetual spree. Eating food, drinking wine, thinking good like the privilege to dine me. I like drinking the drink I'm drinking. I like thinking the thoughts I'm thinking. I like songs, I like dance, I hear music and I'm in a trance. Tra-la-la, pa-pa, chances are we shall get up and prance. Where there's music and laughter, happiness is bright. Why? Because I like life. See how much we like life. Thank you for being with me here in These Small Hours.